For Republican leaders on Capitol Hill, it is all systems go on tax reform.
If this was a tax increase in the middle-income taxpayers, we wouldn't be doing this.
Yeah.
This is about lowering people's taxes in the middle class.
President Trump signaled on Twitter he's ready to go, writing, "This now allows for the passage of large-scale tax cuts and reform, which will be the biggest in the history of our country." The Senate approved the 2018 budget late last night, 51-49, with Kentucky Senator Rand Paul the only Republican voting against it.
We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to replace a failing tax code that holds Americans back with one that actually works for them.
Paul tweeted this morning, quote, "I'm all in for tax cuts at real Donald Trump, the biggest, boldest cuts possible, and soon." House GOP sources suggest it's quite likely the House will approve what the Senate sends over to avoid a time-consuming conference. And House leaders are hoping that will lead to passing tax reform by Thanksgiving.
This keeps us on the timetable to get this to the president's desk by the end of the year. And we know that's an ambitious timetable. We think, look, America's falling behind. People are sick of this tax code. It's time to move.
There's a sense of urgency in the Senate as well, with 2 of the 52 Republicans dealing with health issues, John McCain and Thad Cochran. There's also the wild card of the election to fill the Alabama Senate seat. In a recent Fox News poll, Republican Roy Moore was tied with his Democratic opponent, Doug Jones. And Democrats are already attacking the tax proposal.
Lower the tax rate on big corporations in the top 1%. Repeal the estate tax, which only goes to estates of over $5 million. And eliminate critical middle-class tax breaks like state and local deductibility.
Senator Lindsey Graham is promising to offer a minimum wage increase, phasing it in to $10.10 an hour, arguing businesses can absorb it as long as their taxes are cut.
Graham suggests that could win over some Democrats. If they raise the minimum wage and cut taxes, that could help make the case they're looking out for the little guy. Brett?
Mike Emanuel live on the Hill. Mike, thanks.
You could argue that the gains we're seeing in the stock market today are really due not so much to any clarification on who will run the Fed, but on something that happened last night. The Senate last night kickstarting Republicans' massive tax reform effort after passing a $4 trillion budget deal, 51-49, with Senator Rand Paul, the lone Republican, with a no vote. However, even though a fiscal year 2018 budget blueprint passed the Senate, both the House and the Senate still need to agree on this final budget resolution between their 2 different versions of the measure, with the House plan calling for revenue-neutral tax reform, meaning not adding to the deficit. That is a hard trick to pull off. Here to discuss the hurdles the GOP still needs to jump over, a Fox Business exclusive with Representative Tom Reed of New York, who serves on the House Ways and Means Committee. Welcome, Congressman. As a Republican, I want to just get right off to this. You must have been happy last night that the Senate is pushing it back to you all, but now you've got a big mountain to climb, and that is getting things revenue neutral on this budget. How are you going to do that? Because right now I've seen a lot of guesstimates that say it adds to the deficit.
Well, you know, obviously last night was good news out of the Senate. They moved, and now we're going to take up that vehicle, and I'm very confident we'll get it to the finish line in the House. That sets up tax reform. And as you talk about revenue neutrality, obviously that's a difficult task. But the time is now, and the time is upon us to get this done for the American people.
Well, one way that you could get in more revenue to erase whatever debt is being compiled with these new plans is this so-called SALT plan. I guess, in essence, it's really for high-tax states, but it would affect all states, that they would eliminate the deduction for state and local taxes that people in New York and California and higher tax states have really depended on to kind of even out a very hefty tax bill overall. You are from the state of New York. Are you for eliminating this deduction or against it, like your fellow Republican compatriots in New York, Peter King, and a few others on the Democratic side?
Well, of course, when you talk about state and local tax deduction coming from New York, it's something I've made my thoughts known on from day one. But I do believe there's a solution to this problem. It's a $1.3 billion worth of score space that the state and local deduction represents. And what we need to do is maybe we can find the common ground where we can come to a compromise solution that stands for the hardworking taxpayers of the districts across New York, as well as in the city of New York. And I think there's a path there. And I'll tell you, there's been some very positive conversations amongst members that say, you know what, we got to get tax reform done for all Americans, but at the same time, we got to respect how this impacts the state and local tax deduction on our constituents that we represent in Washington.
I think what bothers a lot of people is that corporations would still be allowed to deduct it, but individuals couldn't. And when asked about that, President Trump said, well, you got to let corporations do it, otherwise they'll go out of business. If you don't let individuals do it, some of them may go bankrupt. I mean, this is an issue. But let's dovetail to the fact that people are now wondering about this fourth tax bracket that President Trump talked about a couple of weeks ago, but that Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, kind of confirmed today, this morning, in fact, on during a television interview. What do you consider a high net worth level in a bracket that would be that fourth so-called tax on the wealthy?
Well, you know, I was sitting right next to the president when he made the first public announcement about how the wealthy is not the goal of getting tax cuts to the wealthy as part of tax reform, that the wealthy may have to pay a little bit more even at the end of the day. And what we're talking about with this fourth bracket is to make sure we honor that mission, that we're going to relieve the tax burden on hardworking Americans that we represent across the nation. And when we talk about the highest bracket being put back into the mix, I think that's a legitimate recognition of where we stand. And let's face it, the other side has said repeatedly they want to make sure the top 1% pay their fair share. And you've seen Warren Buffett out there. Well, let's honor what Warren Buffett wants to do and pay a little bit more in order to get the relief for 300 million plus Americans.
Let me just interrupt you here for a moment, Congressman. You're looking at Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis and John McCain, the Republican senator from Arizona. They're standing, folks, this is breaking news, live pictures. They are standing outside Senator McCain's office. Brad, what are they talking about here? I can't hear.
Thank you.
They are talking about the Niger situation, the firefight on October 5th that killed four U.S. soldiers. I just want to listen in because, of course, Senator McCain is head of the House Armed Services. The Senate Armed Services Committee.
Regular meetings so that we can work together in these very difficult and challenging times. I am proud to know him.
Secretary Mattis, would you say that it's a matter of days?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Secretary Mattis, would you say that it's a matter of hours or a matter of days or months?
Reporters are trying to get an answer about an investigation that is now being launched into that firefight where at least one serviceman was left behind for 48 hours in Niger after the firefight. And there was no answer as to a timeline for that. Representative Reed, did you hear that?
I did. That is news to me, and I'm sure we'll get to the bottom of it, because when we talk about our men and women that are in harm's way, it unites us as a country. Get to the bottom of anything that's occurring in order to make sure that we do our best to make sure they come home safe and sound in future events.
Absolutely. We want to thank you very much, Representative Tom Reed of New York.
President Trump and the White House taking the bull by the horns on the tax plan. Roll tape.
This change, along with a lower business tax rate, would likely give the typical American household around a $4,000 pay raise.
There's a big literature that looks at how lots of other countries have done the same thing and how their wages responded. And we take a very conservative edge of that literature, like the low-end estimates, apply the Trump tax plan to it and get that it's going to increase wages for American workers by about $4,000.
Reducing the corporate tax rate from 35% to 20% would increase average household income by $4,000 a year.
Well, that is the major talking point and selling point. $4,000 extra in the pockets of working families. Ed Lazar's with us, former chair of the President Bush's Council of Economic Advisors. Ed, great to have you back with us.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
That $4,000 number, Kevin Hassett justified it yesterday, went through the math. You with it?
Right.
I mean, are we going to get $4,000 in the pocket of working families if we get the tax rate down to 20%?
Well, the question, of course, is whether we get enough growth to generate that kind of earnings increase over time. Kevin's numbers are based on the end of the period, so it's essentially saying when all the growth numbers are in, then we can expect $4,000. And that's not too far out of line with the numbers I came up with. In my Wall Street Journal piece, I had numbers that were a bit smaller than that, about half actually, but The difference was that I was looking at the average over that period. He's looking at the end of that period. So it's quite possible. I mean, we're not, the reality is we're not that perfect at predicting these sorts of things, but the number is not a crazy number.
But it makes sense,
if we get the kind of
sorry, but if you want to sell something and you want to bring it down to the level where everybody understands it, you say, I'm going to put X $1,000s in your pocket if we get this tax cut. That's a pretty strong selling point, if you ask me.
Well, it is, and I think the tax plan is pretty good, even as it stands right now. I had some suggestions for some modifications, but even as it stands right now, I think it's definitely a step in the right direction, and I do think it will grow the economy. And it will affect the middle class primarily in two ways. First, the direct tax cuts. We don't know exactly what they're going to look like until we see how the brackets play out and how the rates play out. But the second thing, of course, is that when you have economic growth, that translates into productivity growth. Productivity growth turns into wage growth. So some of that, at least a significant fraction of that, is going to be passed on to the middle class. And so I think that the administration is actually not spinning this tale. This is actually something that is consistent with the kinds of numbers that we've seen in the past. So,
heaven forbid.
So I'm pretty much on their side on this one.
Heaven forbid that the Republican Party rejects a tax cut like this. But let's move on. I want you to listen to what Senator Paul had to say about his vote on the budget. Hold on a second, Ed. Roll tape for us.
We as Republicans say we are for these budget caps. If we'll say and do what we say we're for, I'll vote for the budget. But if we're not going to be conservative, I can't vote for it.
What do you say, Ed? Senator Paul standing in the way of the budget, which therefore stands in the way of tax cuts?
Well, first of all, I think it would be a disaster to refrain from passing any kind of tax reform right now. That would be terrible. We really need to get the economy moving. We've had very slow growth, and this is probably the most important thing we can do at this stage to enhance economic growth for the next few years. So I think that would just be a terrible thing to do. I am sympathetic to the senator's view. We obviously can't blow up the budget. But I think that he's focusing on the wrong thing. And the reason is this. If we look out and we say, well, let's use Congressional Budget Office numbers, CBO numbers, we know that in a couple of decades, we're going to be at a point where we have a debt to GDP ratio of something like 150% of what it is right now. And all of that, almost all of that, is on the entitlement side. It all has to do with increases in medical expenditures and retirement expenditures. And, so the kinds of things that we're talking about are essentially rounding error relative to that. In order to get the budget under control, we have to deal with the more significant problems. And these kinds of issues are just second or third order at this point. So, while I'm sympathetic to the point of view that we got to control the budget, and no question about it, this is just not the right way to do it. And I think it's counterproductive.
Just get it done. Ed Lazear, thanks for joining us, sir. We'll see you again real soon. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.